Sup and welcome back. Today I'm going to be showing you how to build a shelter. For this shelter building, you're going to need a tarp, at least 4 pegs, at least 4 tiny ropes, and 1 long, larger rope. And that's all you're going to need. Your first step is to find an area where you're going to set up your shelter. So I suggest a group of trees that is a distance apart that's about as wide as your tarp, possibly a little bit wider. You don't want to make it smaller than your tarp because then you're going to run into some troubles with folding when it does come to your tarp. So I've chosen this area. I've cleared some sticks out of the way, so then there will be some sitting room, and then these trees here. Today I'm being a little bit craftier with the items that I have. So I have my tarp, this one, general tarp. You can get them at Canadian Tire, things like that. Then I have my longer rope, my more secure rope, and I have a group of pegs and guy lines here. It's kind of a bit of a mess right now, but it'll all come together as we go through the process. All right, so now that you're all set up with everything that you're going to need for your shelter building, you are going to first start off with your larger rope. So your larger rope, we're going to use the same concept that I showed in my knots video. You can check that out up here if you want to learn more about how to set up your first rope. And so we're just going to use a bowline to a hitch on the other side, and I'll fast forward. If you want to check out how to do that, you can check out the knots video again. If not, then you can just keep watching. All right, so I've set up my line here. It's above my head just a little bit, so then I am able to reach it still, but it's also going to be possibly just a bit lower once I add my tarp here. So then I'm still able to walk under it once my tarp is attached, and so my shelter is head height. It's a little bit above my head height due to the fact that I want it to still be able to fit me underneath. And so when you're attaching the sides of your tarp, they're going to be lower than your head height, and so when you are walking underneath your rope, you can choose different distances from the ground just to make your shelter. And so this is just what I've chosen for now. You can make it shorter, you can make it taller. This also depends on how long your guy lines are or how wind safe you want it to be. If it's closer to the ground, you have less room for your tarp to move, unless you have a super large tarp, in which case I would measure your tarp before choosing the height of your rope. So my tarp isn't that large, and so I'm able to do head height, but if I wanted to make it more wind safe, I would in fact put it closer to the ground. All right, so my next step, because it's not windy for me here, is I'm laying out my tarp on top of the line that I've just shown. So because it's not windy, I'm able to do this. If it is super windy where you are, you can do this from the ground. So I'm going to take each of the corners here on my tarp and add guy lines to them. I'm going to do this using our taut line hitch or our Cheerio knot. So then I'm able to adjust each of the corners when I have attached them. So I'm going to attach each of my ropes using the bowline to the little loops on my tarp here. I'm going to do this on each of the corners of my tarp. And then, so the bowline is going to be attached to the loop, and then the other side that will be attached to the peg, that's where I'm using my taut line hitch. All right, let's take a moment and talk about what kind of pegs we're gonna use when attaching our guy lines into the ground with our tarp. So what our taut line hitch is going to be attached to is a peg. Unless you have sticks or something else that you're going to use, there's another tree maybe nearby that you can attach your shelter to and save on those pegs for vital things like your tent. So Generally, you want to bring enough pegs for your shelter as well as your tent, but when you're setting up, maybe you didn't really think it through, maybe you don't have enough, so that's when you're going to use sticks or other trees. So, starting with the worst peg. So the worst peg is your yellow peg. You have to hammer these guys in so good if it's going to stay, or if it's going to keep your shelter up. I don't like these pegs. It's going to take you forever to set up anything if you do have a peg that looks like this. Generally, you want to go with a metal peg, and so your metal pegs can be a few different types. So we have our tinier, kind of skinny metal peg. This will do you some good, but they can bend really easily. And so when you're out in the field, having these can do you some good, but if it's windy at all, or if there's any sort of tough turf that you're dealing with, these generally don't do you as good as you think. So my favorite of all of the pegs that you can choose is your kind of thicker metal peg, the one that's not going to bend as easily if you do have to hammer it into the ground. So now that you know what kind of peg to choose, we're going to move on. So using your peg to attach your tarp to the ground. This is where your taut line hitch comes in handy. So again, refer back to the the video on knots, because you're gonna need to know how to use your Cheerio your Cheerio knot or your taut line hitch. So because it's adjustable, it will allow you to adjust either side due to wind. And you won't have to like replace any of the things or knots. Other knots work as well. That one's just my personal favorite and one I've been taught to use. So now that you know what kind of peg to use and what one not to use, I'm going to show you how to place the peg into the ground. So you generally want to place the peg into the ground, not at a 90-degree angle, but at about a 60-degree angle. And you don't want, so the head of the peg here, this guy, you don't want it facing the tarp, because then your guy lines are just going to slip right off. They're going to go up and around if there's any sort of wind whatsoever. If there's no wind, you can use whatever tactic you want to stick these guys into the ground, because it's not really going to matter. But if there's any wind whatsoever, you want to follow this step. I would generally set up my site using this step regardless, because there could be wind in the middle of the night you don't know is coming, or any sort of thing of the matter. So you're going to set your peg at a 60-degree angle. It's going to face, you want to hammer it into the ground enough so that only the top part is sticking out and you can see a little bit of your string from your guy line. So when you're doing so, you want it on a 60-degree angle, you want it facing away, and you want it to look like it's almost not there at all. Although your guy line will stick out, and so you will have to make sure everyone at your site knows not to trip or fall over any of your guy lines that could be there. Okay, so I've set up the other three corners, and then I'm just gonna take this guy line and I'm gonna try to tie. So we want it 60-degree angle facing away, all the way into the ground, and then we want up. You want to make sure it's tight, nice and tight. It's not going to come loose, and then you're going to tie your taut line. 1, move that leaf. 2, 3, let's go 4 for good measure. And then you're going to come back. It's going to be a little bit different because we are using hockey lace, and then it's going to come underneath like so, and then make sure that doesn't leave the ground, and then you can tighten all that you need there, and then you can possibly daisy chain this off do what you need to do to keep your campsite as neat and as tidy as possible when you're dealing with this. So that's kind of how you tie that into the ground. And then if we look at the rest of our shelter, it's all nice and up. So just to show you an example, I have tied this side to the tree here, as well as this side over here. If you are using more guy lines, it will be less awkward on the back side here. Also, I have shown using 2 smaller guy lines as well as 2 long guy lines to attach the tarp. So once you get inside the tarp, it'll give you nice little space for you to cook or do whatever you need with. And that's how to build your general shelter. If you need any more tips and tricks on how to build your campsite or how to set up your campsite, you can check out my other videos, and I hope you have a great day.